An error many comrades and I see consistently within the discussions of imperialism is the question of how anti-imperialism is dealt with, or more accurately, how this anti-imperialism must manifest. It's common for people to discuss anti-imperialism as anti-US imperialism, viewing any action that curbs the American hegemony as an act of anti-imperialism. Although it is correct to understand that the US hegemony is a primarily important character in the current imperialist era, it is a one-sided error to claim that anti-imperialism lies with curbing the US hegemony, especially when you notice that imperialism is a multifaceted international economic phenomena of capitalism and of capital expansion. In the early days of imperialism, Lenin had sought to define and correctly understand a higher stage of capitalism, imperialism. From the ruins of colonialism of the feudal era, imperialism came as a method of economic expansion and development that utilized many tactics to dominate and expand into another nation's economy. Lenin saw this economic phenomena and defined it with 5 major characteristics. The concentration of industrial and banking capital merging and creating a monopoly financial bourgeoisie. The dominance of finance capital. The primary character of exportation of finance capital. The division of the world economy according to imperialist corporations. The political division of the world according to these economic divisions. These 5 characteristics lined out and defined the actions and behaviors of many major and minor imperialist powers across Europe during Lenin's era. The major nations that Lenin saw as opponents of communism and Marxism are that of the British and the Germans, with other nations like France, America, Italy, Russia, and others aligning themselves with either camp of the imperialist world. This division between 2 camps of the imperialist world came from the dominance of finance capital within each nation's monopolistic bourgeoisie, and ever-intensifying desire to expand capital into former colonies or new places. This ever-intensifying desire of the bourgeoisie of each nation only led into the major imperialist war known today as World War I. And even within bourgeois history books, we understand that 4 major reasons for World War I were known by the acronym MAIN: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. Marxists would generally understand that the militarism aspects, the alliances, and the nationalism all connect inherently to imperialism as the basis. But as World War I started and was being fought each day, there was a deeply important struggle occurring in the Second International that concerned the discussion of imperialism. Who should we support in this war? Some took the sides of supporting the Germans in opposition to the British imperialists. Some of the British involved in this conversation took the side of the British in this war, and even Russians took the side of the Russian-British imperialist powers, although these Russians were outside of the Bolsheviks. But Lenin was the only one to take a clear stance of revolutionary defeatism. The imperialist war, started by imperialists, fought for imperialists, tainted the soil with the blood of the working class, soaking the pockets of the bourgeoisie with this blood. Working class people were forced to fight for imperialist powers and dying by the hands of imperialist militaries, provided no benefits to the working class movement and its own liberation. Lenin emphasizes this idea of transforming the imperialist war into the civil war, and deeply struggling against imperialism of all forms. In addition, Lenin waged a ruthless struggle against opportunism and revisionism, both which served the imperialist interests and fought against the working class interests. The working class cannot play its world revolutionary role unless it wages a ruthless struggle against this regency, spinelessness, subservience to opportunism, and an unexampled vulgarization of the theories of Marxism. Struggle against imperialism that is not closely linked with the struggle against opportunism is either an empty phrase or a fraud. Both these quotes by Lenin emphasizes his stance on revisionism, and thus the stance Marxists should take against it. This particularly refers to the social imperialist and social chauvinist stances made by the Second International, that sought to support one side in World War I over the other, in the hopes it'll bring working class liberation sooner than later. In our times, we see the same mentality manifest across many organizational spaces and so-called leftist spaces. This opportunist position relates to the anti-US imperialism position that lessens or dampens or even outright denies the effects and problems of other imperialist hegemonies. These people believe in the Brezhnevite policy of actually existing socialism, which essentially amounts to understanding that a socialist state is socialist through rhetoric and symbolism, and barely through principle. They consider nations like China, a modern-day imperialist power, a socialist country because of the actions it takes against US imperialism, which is the modern-day hegemonic power of the world. Or it considers states like Cuba or Vietnam, who have a comprador bourgeoisie who are subservient to foreign capital. And all of this due to rhetoric and positioning between two major camps in the imperialist world. The question of anti-imperialism lies in recognizing China as a social imperialist power, a nation which has stock markets, financial banks that exports loans to underdeveloped semi-colonies, place the local bourgeoisie in favor of Chinese firms building their industry and their railroads, and especially dominating the markets within these areas that in turn create a political divide between the compradors of US capital and Chinese capital. This does nothing but harm the working class of each nation that has to suffer this imperialist conflict between Chinese and US capital. It is of utmost importance to oppose their influence in national liberation movements and especially their opposition to communist movements, just as much as it is important to oppose the influence of US imperialism. Lastly, we see the physical examples of China creating this clear economic domination through exportation of capital, manifesting as foreign aid and loans, creating the political divides in places like India or the Philippines, where we see two major communist established peoples war being targeted as major terrorist organizations and funding the governments explicitly to curb the growth of the people's wars. We see inter-imperialist conflict manifest with Iran as a major benefactor of the Belt and Road Initiative, the massive imperialist project to connect railways and build industry, all led and funded by Chinese financial banks and firms, fighting a mini-Cold War with the Saudis, a benefactor of the US oil and military-industrial complex. To be an anti-imperialist is to oppose imperialism full stop. We mustn't give any recognition to lesser evilism in the imperialist world, and we must task the revolutionaries of all nations to fight for their own proletarian liberation. There is one and only one kind of real internationalism, and that is working wholeheartedly for the development of the revolutionary movement and the revolutionary struggle in one's own country, and supporting by propaganda, sympathy, and material aid this struggle, this and only this line in every country without exception. Everything else is deception.